Todd, thank you for being with us.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah. So when you and I talked as we were preparing for this series, and the reason why I was really excited to have you here is we had talked extensively about how you had selected your own graduate postdoc lab as a trainee and what are the things you had in mind. And I want to say something, you weren't there in the first session, but one of our presenters asked people to raise their hand if they wanted to be a faculty, and almost everyone in the room raised their hands. And we have about the same signups for both sessions. Mm-hmm. But then this next speaker asked, how many of you are sure you want to be a faculty? Or actually asked, how many of you are not entirely sure you want to be a faculty? And then a large proportion of people raised their hand. So I think you were also asking yourself about that when you were going through this process. And I'd love for you to talk about this and what were the criteria that you had in mind that helped you develop, that you felt were important for you to develop an independent research program and ultimately become a faculty career when you were choosing a lab. We have a few graduate students and some postdocs might be considering changing labs. So I think that might be good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I could start out with a sort of a brief summary of the path I've taken to get here. I had some more specific things to talk about that are directly addressing your questions here. But So I did my graduate work at the University of Washington, and I initially went to graduate school more out of an interest to become a teacher than out of an interest in doing research. And then while I was in graduate school, I really discovered a passion for research and found that that was a direction I could see myself going in more often, but I had still held on to this idea of really wanting to teach as well. And that really factored into pretty much every decision I made from the time I started in graduate school, where I'll as I said, I'll answer the question more directly later, but this interest in teaching and research together was on my mind from the beginning. And so as I selected a lab to do my graduate work in, and as I selected a lab to do my postdoctoral work in, I was always thinking about whether this type of research would be compatible with a career where I also did a lot of teaching. That was, for example, one of the main reasons I chose to go into labs that worked with model systems, C. elegans as a graduate student and Drosophila as a postdoctoral fellow, because those organisms are very traditionally used in undergraduate research labs. They're relatively cheap to work with and lend themselves well to teaching environments. So that was definitely on my mind from the beginning. And although I don't think it was as intentional, I do think it helped. It caused me to be more drawn towards labs that where the faculty member was themselves a very good teacher, and I could sort of see in them a role model as the teacher, not just as a scientist. And so that, I'm not sure there was a very conscious decision there, but I think my own interest in teaching sort of drew me to like-minded people in that way. So that's very brief. I sort of abbreviated it because I thought we were getting to the questions, but I don't know if that's what you were fishing for with that intro.
Perfect. That's exactly what I want people to hear. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So with this first question, sort of like how did I select a graduate lab, a postdoc lab as a trainee, and what sort of criteria did I have in mind? Some of it was intentional, some of it not so much. I think I'm reflecting back. I probably had many different factors in my mind that weighed in. And in kind of reflecting back on the experience, I think it could be distilled into a couple broad, very interconnected categories. And really the first and most obvious is the science itself. Am I interested in the science? And then the second is the mentorship environment in the lab. Do I connect with the people and the faculty member in the lab? And then the third is the kind of, how will this prepare me training-wise for what I'm looking for? And that's kind of touched upon a little bit. I was looking for labs where the mentor was a role model in teaching, where the kind of science would lead towards a type of position I imagine myself having. But really, to sort of start with the first one, the science, I imagine many of us are like this. I think we're, especially, if you're passionate about research and interested in doing scientific research, the pursuit of it itself is what's so enjoyable. And for me, there are such a huge wide range of topics I could find myself getting really excited about, because in so many different disciplines, in so many different cases, um, there are unknowns to be solved and riddles to be puzzled over. And so that's great, because it means there's a lot of choice to choose from. It also makes it difficult to choose from those among those choices. And it's a very personal decision for me. I think I've been doing basic science research since my first days in the lab, and find that I'm personally very motivated by sort of purely driven by curiosity, and just motivated to understand how things work, and kind of love the purity of science, that, like, if something is just inherently seems to me like a beautifully elegant idea, that's really appealing to me. And none of that is there, and this is going to help somebody who's sick someday. I hope our research does have an impact, and when I talk to the public or people in my family about the work I do, I really emphasize how important it is to understand how the body works normally under normal health conditions, before we can start to really understand disease and help people who have medical issues. In the same way that we teach mechanics how a car works, not what to do if it's broken. We need to teach ourselves how the body works so that we can understand the problems that arise. And I fundamentally believe that that's a really important role for basic science in the healthcare system. But on my day-to-day, I'm motivated by my own curiosity and my own just drive to figure out how things work. And so among the broad, huge number of topics that I could really get excited about, the ones that draw me most are ones where I think there's the most opportunity to dig down into a complex question. And those tend to be areas where maybe the field is relatively new and there's still very big questions left to answer. That was certainly the case when I started working on stem cell biology, and we didn't really even know what a stem cell was. And so the field hasn't been studied for so many decades that we're now down to just understanding which two amino acids touch each other when this process happens, but there's still very big, broad questions left to answer. So that's exciting to me. And it's also really exciting to me when I can see a field has made a change recently that really makes it much more cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary, when a field sort of crosses boundaries. And I'm not an immunologist. I've never really known much about immunology, but all these recent developments that have made immunology become so much more relevant for cancer therapy is really exciting. In developmental biology, we've been taking a lot more advantage now of bioinformatics and mathematical modeling, high throughput data set kind of analysis, and it's bringing a completely different perspective to the field. And so I think those kinds of things that really shake up a field are also exciting. Transcription is another one. 10 years ago, I would have thought that, it seemed to me like the field was studying the same aspects of transcription that I learned about in the textbooks in college and in high school. And then all of a sudden, we're now looking at Todds and how parts of the genome interact with one another, and new forms of gene regulation that come about because of the 3D architecture of chromosomes inside the nucleus. And so that's super exciting to me. So when I see those kinds of really big seismic changes in fields that bring in new disciplines, or when the field itself is very new, those are things that have always appealed to me and played a big role in helping me narrow down among the millions of things I could become excited about, which ones I'm going to actually spend my day in, day out thinking about. So that's the science side. I'm happy to talk about that more if people would like. The mentor side is really just, everybody's different. It's a matter of do you connect? And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. I think it's relatively easy to find good science. It's not always the case that good science is done in a place where it's a supportive mentoring environment. And I've seen so many times friends and colleagues of mine going into labs because they're excited by the science because it's very high profile. Maybe the labs are publishing very well, and not paying enough attention to what it's like to be in the lab. And that's important not just for your kind of daily comfort level, your overall sanity as a person going to work every day, but it also really is important for making sure that you are in a space where you can be creative and productive. I think if you're feeling not well supported in the work environment, it's really hard to be creative and to do your best science. And so that's why I mean they're so interconnected. So that's just something I don't know if I have anything specific to say about what makes a good mentor. I think it's very personal for each individual, and one lab that's really perfect for one person is exactly the wrong kind of environment for somebody else. So I think enough is said to just be aware of that. And then the career development side of it is also, like a really obvious thing to look for is whether other people have come through the lab and done something similar to where you envision yourself being. I mean, if it's a young lab, then there's maybe not enough people who come through to make that determination. But if a lab's been around for 10 years, they should probably have had a few people come through the lab that have tried to do or are doing now what you're doing. And you can see that there's an actual path for you to follow. But it extends beyond that. I think that, and this maybe starts to get into some of the next question here too. Really, it makes so much sense at an earliest stage if possible to start having conversations with your future mentor or your current mentor about where you think you want to go and how they would think you can get there, and really just making them aware that you have these interests and going in this direction so that they can also start preparing for help you prepare for that. And so I think like a really concrete example of this is that when I chose my postdoc lab, I left University of Washington and went to the Carnegie Institution, now it's Bradley's lab. At that point, I still really thought that I wanted to mostly teach and do a little bit of research on the side. And I recognized that I was going to need to get more teaching experience as a postdoc so that I would be competitive for those kinds of jobs. And so I interviewed in 4 or 5 places around the country at MIT and UCSF, and every one of those interviews, one of the first things I asked was, well, I'm interested in getting some teaching experience as a postdoc. How do you feel about that? And have you had postdocs who have done that before? And what kinds of, what's your response to that? And I got a really wide range of answers. Some people would say, I don't know, I think we have a local school, you could probably figure it out, maybe, or, I've never heard of anyone doing that before. And not never heard of anyone, but it didn't seem like it was a very common path for those labs. And Alan's response was great, where he said, I've had 1 or 2, I've had many postdocs come through and only a very small number who are interested in that, but I'm very supportive of it. And in fact, I have a connection at the biology department at the University of Baltimore, Maryland, University of Maryland, Baltimore. And, I think it'd be really great for you here's how we would set it up, and you would get your project going, and then you could do this in the 3rd year or something like that. And it was, sort of speaking off the cuff, and it wasn't like there was a lot of people who'd come through his lab who did this, but the fact that it didn't faze him at all, that he was totally excited and open and willing for me to do that was a really good sign. As it turns out, I've discovered how satisfying it can be to teach through research. And here I am at a place without undergraduates, and I still feel like I do a lot of teaching. It's a huge part of my job. So that was yet another evolution in my process. And I didn't actually end up doing that teaching class at the University of Maryland, but it was there, and it was a sign that that was going to be a really good mentoring situation for my career. There's one other thing I would add on that third thing that I don't know if this occurs to many people, but as a graduate student, I didn't have a lot of perspective on, what is out there. Like I could read papers, I could get a sense for what the field is like, but I hadn't met a lot of other faculty outside of my institution. I didn't know what the range of mentoring environments were, and how they differed from different places. So I actually just started going and knocking on office doors of other faculty at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center where I was doing my graduate work. And I went to probably 5 different faculty and I just said, okay, independent of research topic, because I can get excited in a lot of things, where do you think is the best environment for preparing somebody to become a faculty member? And I got, and also I had a list of faculty I was interested in, and I said, well, what do you think about these labs? Are these labs good places for faculty, for postdocs to go if they want to become faculty? And I was really surprised by how candid those responses were. There was a lab I was super interested in that I was about to apply, and a couple people said, their postdocs never get faculty, the positions, that faculty member is really well known for treating the postdocs poorly and competing against them when they do get faculty positions, so I would not recommend it. And so I said, okay, crossed off the list. And conversely, I learned about places. Actually, UCSF came up a lot as a place that has a reputation for really nurturing postdocs and helping them get faculty positions. The Carnegie, where I went, is another one, as well as the MRC in London or somewhere in the UK. So it was super helpful. It was another really good way to kind of cut down a long list of names, shorten down a long list of names.
That's great. That's super helpful. I want to reiterate this piece about really taking the time to ask your network about, the opportunities and the best place for you to be. This is something we talked about, and actually that was one of the assignments for this week, which we don't have time to go over in groups, but we asked people to make a list of 3 people they could reach out to, either to get feedback on their research proposal, or if they're at an earlier stage, get information about a career track or potential mentors. So I think this is something you can add to your list of questions to ask people in the field. What is a good lab where I could be if you're a graduate student, or if you're a postdoc thinking changing labs. That's great. It's very helpful. I wanted to come back to this idea of having this independence conversation.
Yeah.
And when you and I talked, we talked about the fact that the postdoc lab you chose, because the PI was so great at teaching, I guess, was really, he set up everything so that your first few months or your first year was about developing the project that would be your own project. And you spent a lot of time on this. And so I'd love for you to talk more about this, and also move into kind of your faculty role now, or mentor role, which I think you also mentor people outside your lab, and kind of thinking, if you had to give advice to people who haven't had this opportunity yet, how would they navigate this conversation? And kind of what we really hope to get is your perspective as a faculty to kind of explain, where the faculty comes from potentially in that discussion, to help that discussion be like a productive.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that this was an element of the mentee mentorship relationship that I was completely oblivious to as a graduate student applying to postdocs. I had no idea that this was something I should be looking out for, and would not have even thought, but I think that I ended up going to a lab where this process was very smooth and was really well designed to help me transition from a postdoc into a faculty position, in large part because I had taken that step of asking people, well, what labs are good for helping people become a faculty member? I didn't know what it took to help someone become a faculty member, but by just asking that broad question, it helped narrow down labs where those answers had been thought through and were available. And so, the way it worked for me in my experience, I interviewed at several places, got offers from each of them, and then decided to go to Alan's lab. And over the course of about 4 months from when I accepted the offer to when I showed up in the lab, we emailed back and forth, you know, maybe not weekly, but many, many times over that course, where his first email was a very broad, open-ended kind of email, like, I'm so glad you're going to join the lab. This is great. What do you want to work on? And so I, you know, read lots of papers and thought about the conversations I had when I was interviewing in the lab and the things people were working on. And I had originally become interested in his research because of, so this was in 2004. I had originally become interested in some of his research because of papers he had published in the mid-90s on germ cell biology. And so I was ready to go to his lab and work on that. And I spent a couple months reading up on those papers and the follow-up papers and coming up with new ideas and sending him things. And it was not really gaining traction. I think every time I sent him something, he would say like, I don't think that's gonna work, or that's too close to something that somebody else is working on in the lab, or we don't really have, you know, the field has moved in a different direction since then. And really, you know, without directly telling me, you know, more of kind of like subtle guidance, steering me towards, in a way, different possible projects. And then after exploring, you know, lots of avenues in that area, I decided to just completely switch and start thinking about something else. I tried another couple of topics, and then after, as I said, 4 months of emails back and forth, sort of settled on the idea, circling kind of close back to where I started, in the same part of the, studying the same part of fly biology, but not the germ cells, the somatic cells, which are right next to them. And once I came up with the idea to start studying those cells, which had, Alan's lab had published one paper on in 1995, but hadn't really studied since then. Then all my ideas he loved, and he's like, yes, I think it's exactly the right time to start studying those again. And it almost gave me the impression, and may not be true, that he was just waiting for me to actually, that's where he really wanted me to work on. He was waiting for me to arrive at that myself. And maybe not, I'm sure I could have come up with something else. Somebody else came to the lab shortly after and ended up studying a completely different cell type, and I'm sure she went through the same process. So maybe also he's wondering if that free association period will lead to a completely different topic that even he didn't think about. I don't really know. But in my case, I think he was kind of hoping I would study this. And it was good for me because I learned a lot, but also because when I showed up in the lab, I really felt like I had ownership of my project from day one. It was something that he didn't say like, oh, this is aim 2 of my grant and I want you to work on this. That he was saying, you know, I was able to say, you know, this is an idea I came up with, you know, with guidance from him, but it was an idea I came up with. And so it was such a much more powerful way to start the project. So if for those of you who have not yet started your postdoc, if you find yourself in having that kind of interaction, then fantastic. You know, if not, then there are ways to help this kind of thing along. And I think that you know, when it works really well is when you apply to the lab, not just because you like the science, but because there's something specific about the work being done there where you think you could make a contribution. And if you're showing up at your postdoc interviews by saying like, I'm, you know, excited about the work here in general, and I can see myself working on a lot of things, but I actually have an idea for something. And even if it's not one that you end up working on, or even if the idea turns out to not be very good in the beginning, like my initial ideas about germ cell biology, I think it starts out right from the beginning to set a tone with the faculty member that you're a person who's going to be bringing your own ideas to this lab and to this project. And from a faculty perspective, that's very appealing. First of all, it also really helps to have other, you know, engaged, smart people coming up with good ideas that are related to your research. But it also, it signals that you're not going to need the same kind of security at the beginning in order to get the project off the ground. You know, like one of my concerns when somebody comes to the lab is, I know that there may need to be a 6 to 9 month period where you're kind of getting your feet on the ground and things need to, and many things are not going to work. And we don't know exactly whether this project is going to be worthwhile in the long term. That's going to require some of your effort. But exactly how that 6 to 9 month period goes really varies from one person to the next. And if somebody is looking to be handed something, then that requires a lot more of my um, attention and interaction than if somebody's coming in very independent minded, who has ideas of their own and who says, like, this is where I want to go. And maybe it's not the place I would go first, but it signals to me that, okay, that's how I'm going to do it for this person. I'm going to give them a little bit more freedom. I'm going to let them do something a little bit more on their own. Whereas this person, okay, they might need a little bit more. Maybe I will give them aim 2 of my grant because that's going to at least give them something to work on for the next year or two. And not to say that that's a bad place to start. There's, hopefully the core work that's being funded by grants in the lab is really exciting, important work. And like all work can lead to many more questions. So if you end up working on the core grant of the lab, it doesn't necessarily doom you to not being able to bring anything with you. But it's a slightly different path. And I think to the extent that you can demonstrate that independent thought right up front at the time of the interview, that helps a lot in terms of giving you ownership and signaling to the PI that you're an independent thinker. Maybe I'll pause there unless you see if there are any comments, but then we're also going to get to the actually having these conversations.
Yeah, that'd be great. Actually, I still want to encourage everybody to ask questions. So either on the document, which is bit.ly/grad201c, and grad201c is in all caps, or you can also drop questions, because as I'm listening to Todd, I can check so you can drop questions in the chat box, and I can manage those questions. Yeah, it'd be great to have you move on to having this conversation. And I do want, if we can, to talk about some of the kind of what I was talking about here, kind of the conflicts or the challenges that would be for a PI.
Yeah.
So one thing I was thinking of when you were saying, if somebody comes in and is like, I really want to work on this thing, which was your case, how does that work with funding, for example? Is it possible that a PI would not have the funding to do that? And I guess, other things that you might think.
It's possible. It really depends on the situation that the lab is in. I think and reflecting on the 10 years that I've had my lab, there are certainly periods in that time when I really felt a lot of pressure to get to make progress in a particular area. And to be frank, that's not a very good time to come into my lab as a postdoc trying to make your own project. And so that's something to look out for. So definitely it's possible, but I would say that's the exception rather than the rule. And hopefully most faculty recognize this. It's actually, from our perspective, if we just step back from the needs of the trainee and sort of think about our own career goals and funding and keeping a lab maintained, it is so much better for us to have somebody who's enthusiastic and capable with a new idea come to the lab and develop that idea into a new direction than it is to sort of crank through the things that we've already thought about and we're already excited about and we're already doing. Because so first of all, that the way that a project is funded, especially if it's coming from NIH, other funding agencies are a little bit more rigid, but NIH in particular gives us a lot of latitude in how we can use the grant money on a project. So I probably could not take my grants and start working on something completely different. But if we're studying broadly epithelial stem cell biology, even outside of a fly, even if my whole grant is about studying these epithelial stem cells in a fly ovary, if we come up with a good reason why something we discovered in the fly ovary would be relevant for the mouse intestine, it's not too much of a stretch for me to take some of that grant money and support somebody to ask a question in the mouse intestine. And so I don't feel like like administrative constraints to sort of expanding out. And the converse is that by having somebody come to the lab and with a new project, it can open up a whole new research direction for us both, which leads to more, could potentially lead to more funding, and certainly leads to a lot of interesting science where we get to think about a new field, or not necessarily a whole new field, but our same field in a different way. And it's just a lot more stimulating and interesting for everybody. So, and plus, I think, the way faculty members evaluate each other is to see, like, have you just been working on the exact same question forever, or are you, you're not letting your research stagnate? Are you seeking out new angles, new directions, new things? And, it's ironic that the faculty member usually gets credit for that, because in every one of those cases, it's because a postdoc or a graduate student came with this idea and made it happen. And all the faculty member had to do is just stay out of the way. That is, it's definitely a benefit to us in most cases.
That's really great to hear, Todd. I think I struggle with this thing after doing this ACRA study and looking at how people are hired. One of the things that came across to me was the fact that there's a kind of a challenge for faculty who are on the hiring side to try to decipher who, how much was the postdoc involved in this project, which part, right? How much did they come up with those ideas? And so I know that the chalk talk is a lot about this. A lot of the one-on-one meetings are about that. But if there were a way in our field to actually recognize the contribution of someone, really, like, to be a co-PI as a postdoc, if you are actually, co-designing something with someone, we kind of would be able, right? We'd be able to sidestep this issue, because we do have that opportunity with K-99 grants, for example, or, transitional awards, where a postdoc can say, well, this is my project and this is but it comes in much later in the training, and not as much as, I came into the lab with this project. And I wonder why this isn't done. This is more of a policy question, but I guess.
Yeah, it would be great if there were ways to recognize those contributions at every stage. It's an imperfect system.
We're missing this measure. And it's a major one. It's a really important one, because that's what, as you were saying, what future faculty will be actually assessed on when they are faculty. Were you able to come up with something new, right? So it's fascinating to me that we haven't put this in place.
Yeah, and I would say that it's, I think if you're sort of, from the very beginning, structuring your postdoc in a way that you're bringing your own ideas, you're bringing your own contributions to the project, it will be really easy to make that case in the chalk talk and in the one-on-ones in your faculty interviews, because it's genuine and it's been happening since the beginning. If you are only starting to think about this much later, it's harder, but I would still say it's not impossible. And I think another really common path that I've seen is where, and this is where I got back to, like, it's not always that bad thing to start coming into the lab and working on the core grant that the faculty member is going to keep with them. Something that I've seen very commonly is where a postdoc comes into a lab and does the work that will stay in the lab and is part of the faculty member's sort of core research. But in doing that work, recognizes a huge new area, a niche in the field that hasn't been explored. And although maybe they only have started a paper in that direction, a project in that direction that hasn't become a paper yet, or maybe there's a small paper published in that direction, that can be really effective at the level of chalk talk and faculty hiring position to say, I went into this lab and I gained this, like, really important expertise. Maybe it's, especially if it's a very technical lab, and you gained a really solid experience in a wide range of approaches and experimental approaches and so forth that are important for doing this kind of research. And now that you have that kind of expertise, you're going to take it and apply it over here where no one's done that before. and you haven't done that yet yourself, but it's a good idea, and they can see that that's clearly going to be a new thing that you haven't been doing with your faculty member, because it hasn't even been done yet. So I would
Yeah.
say,
I see this a lot actually in people who are right about the time, very close to applying to faculty position and start thinking about how I'm going to take this and move to a different space with it, right?
right.
I think I'm almost wondering also if this isn't more less risky for a trainee almost. So you said that faculty were really assessed on their ability to go in a new direction. And if you come in early on to the lab with a brand new direction, is there a risk that the PI will be like then submitting an R1 grant and using that direction to support the future
Yeah.
of their, and then you have to can you talk about this conflict that might happen?
Yeah. So that's where communication just becomes so important, and it's not just on this topic, but in every domain of your existence in a lab. It is so much easier to have conversations, early, than it is at a point where it's like you've been frustrated by this or anxious about this for years, and it's finally bubbling over. So I make a point of having these conversations with my trainees at the beginning when they join the lab. I would advise everybody to do this early and often, where you're not talking about the science. We have plenty of conversations where we try to figure out what went wrong with your last experiment. It's more about what are your career goals, where are you going, and how are we going to get you there. In the case of a postdoc looking to transition into a research-intensive faculty position, that means from day one that they need to be thinking about a project that they can take with them. And so in cases where a postdoc has really developed a new direction, like the best case for that is actually a postdoc I have in my lab right now, who's been in the lab for 3 years, and she has really brought in a whole new technology, the single cell sequencing approach, and from that has really discovered some new phenomena for how these cells behave and what they're doing. And it's different enough from what I do that I could, I suppose, try to submit a grant on it, but it would be hard for me to do it without her. I'm sure I could find other people, and I could make it work, but it's not the most natural thing for me to just continue her line of research after she leaves. And I think there's something to that. And it depends on how close your idea is to the core work of what's going on in the lab. But I think if you're having these conversations early, then a combination of being on the same page with your advisor that this is something you're working on, that you are going to start your own research program on, so that from day one, the faculty member is already not trying to make that be the next grant that the whole lab needs to stay afloat. And by putting in all this independent work, doing work that in a way that's different from how it would be done in your lab, in a way that even if the lab tried to follow up on it, it wouldn't be followed up on in the same way. Both of those kinds of things protect against that a lot. But yes, there can, exactly back to what I said before, there can be conflicts, and there's times when it would be much harder for me to have that kind of flexibility that I have now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for being so candid about this. I think it's a conversation we haven't had yet with any faculty, so I'm glad we're starting those. Is there anything that you wanted to give as a piece of advice for people who are going to move into this? Because one thing we've heard from all the speakers before you, or at least for a few, is that they were really uncomfortable with having that discussion, that they had kind of postponed too much, and they all felt, one of them at least said that they felt that they waited too long to have that conversation. And I wonder if you have any tips or any advice about how to approach that beyond all the advice you've already given, kind of.
Well, I would say that it's never too late. I think there's not so much this having this conversation earlier is better than having it later. But I absolutely agree with that line on your slide that's saying if you go on a faculty job talk and they ask you about whether you can bring the work with you and you say, I don't know, that even once is probably enough for you to not get the job. So you absolutely, even if it's uncomfortable, you have to have this conversation. And uncomfortable conversations are inherently unpleasant. I mean, there's no way around it. There you can, I would recommend having this conversation, setting up a time when you can have this conversation. And this is the only topic that the meeting is about, not having having this like expecting to sort of tack this on at the end of otherwise a conversation about the nitty gritty of your project. But really, when you set up the conversation, let the faculty member know you would like to meet with them to discuss, your project and what aspects of it you will be taking with you when you go, so that you are really able to focus the meeting on that conversation, on that topic, and not let it get short shrift because now the hour's up and they've got to go have another meeting or something. And then I find, just as being as sort of blunt and plain spoken about things as possible is good, because sometimes with difficult conversations, I don't know if this is the best example of this kind of difficult conversation, but sometimes with difficult conversations, people are resistant to say what actually needs to be said and instead sort of talk around it. And then in the end, everyone's confused and no one really knows if there was a resolution. Instead, if you're able to go in and say, when I apply for a faculty position, I would like to take I would like to be able to take some research with me. Here is what I propose I take with me. What do you think about that? Is much more straightforward than like, I'm concerned about putting my proposal together. I don't really know what to put into the proposal. Can you help me? Something, it would be like not clear that you're really asking, I need to take research. I need to take this research and use it to start my new lab. What do you think about that? And then also getting to the point in the conversation where you talk about how, will this work be continued in your lab as well? And I remember having that conversation with Alan when I left, and we very clearly delineated what he would continue to work on with these cells and what I would start my lab on. And over the years, our work has merged and grown apart and merged again. But at least at the beginning, we had pretty different takes on what we were going to be doing. And that was the result of a very sort of frank and straightforward conversation.
That's great. Thank you.
The day before you leave for your interview, but it has to happen before your interview.
It has to happen before your interview. This is great. I'm glad to see this echoed and to see that it's such an important piece. It made me think of how to prep this as part of an interview workshop for this fall, and what we would, the advice that we would give. Set up a meeting with your PI before you go out. And if you have it, just don't say, I don't know. Yeah, right. Just do not say, I don't know. Yeah. That came across really, really clearly in the interviews as well. So yeah.
Okay.
There is another question from someone that is asking, and this is a little bit tangential, more about your role as a PI and how you scale and scope your research program. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you change the scale or scope of your research program depending on group size? I would like to know your approach for both the research proposal stage and in practice. And I'm not sure if this question is about scaling the program as a postdoc in different types of labs. I think, to me, I read it more as you move into a faculty position, you're going to start with a small group, or you might be at an RT institution where you will always have a small group. But at least at an R1, you start with a small group, and then over time you scale. Kind of, do you have any advice about this?
Yeah.
Both in how you write your proposal and then how you implement that. Yeah.
This is so important to think about. And I think probably the biggest mistake I made in the first 5 years of having my own lab was exactly in not managing that balance well. The advice you get from people all the time is to, when you start your lab, have a relatively narrow goal and complete it, and get to a point where you publish the paper, where you have really thoroughly addressed a relatively narrow slice of what your overall research interests are, so that you can start showing productivity early on. And I tried to do that initially, but my lab grew quickly right at the beginning. I started with just 2 technicians, but within the first couple of years, I think I had maybe 12 people in the lab. And with each person, I saw a new opportunity to try a totally different project. And I didn't want people's projects to be overlapping with one another. And it really quickly spiraled into something that was hard for me to manage, and hard for any one project to make enough progress to show productivity. And I think so I started my lab in 2009. I think our first paper came out in 2013, which is too long. I think that was not, I should have limited the hiring more and put more people on the same project. Especially if I didn't have, my first couple of hires weren't postdocs trying to start their own labs. My first couple of hires were technicians. I had graduate students, and that was really fun and great to have students. That was part of why I kind of got off track, because the students did come with their own ideas, and I did sort of put them in a separate project from what the technicians were working on. But there's no inherent conflict between having a graduate student and a technician working together on the same project. And so I should have been more focused early, and I wasn't. And so then I kind of corrected a lot and started the lab. I shrunk the lab back down a little bit. I started having people collaborate more within the lab, and I think people really appreciate that. Actually, I had trainees come and tell me, like, it's great that you give us so much intellectual space around our projects, but we like each other. We'd like to collaborate with each other, and we can help each other with these kinds of things. So you should make that more possible. And that's worked better. And now that we kind of we had a period of very high productivity during that time, I'm in a position now where I can start to expand back out again a little bit more, and also have established more outside collaborations that have led to funding in areas that are different from what we do. And so it sort of expanded back out again. So I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer this. I didn't have a grand plan that actually worked. It's been more kind of reactive. But ideally, I think you would find a mix where you have a core group of people really working on we sort of feel like as the fundamental work in the lab, and then as new people come to the lab, it's a complex negotiation. I've heard people say, like, oh, somebody came, I wanted someone to work on this project, but they weren't really, the person who came wasn't really a good fit for that project, so I gave them a different project. As if there's just like this shelf of perfect projects that are ready to be taken on by anybody to come, and they would just select the one that's the best fit for them. It has not worked like that for me. It's been a much more organic process and much more chaotic and not thought through. So, yeah.
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This is super helpful. I want to just give you guys the opportunity to ask questions before we let Todd go. I do have one more comment to make, but I want to see if anybody has a question. You're welcome to either unmute and say your name and ask your question, or you can type it into the chat box at the bottom. If you scroll over to the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat. Wait, I'm seeing, what if you, oh, yeah, there's a question from Rachel, actually, program manager. She asks, what if you clearly develop something, but the mentor doesn't want you to take it? That's the trickiest one.
Yeah.
What if you're in that, you might not have the answer, but what would you recommend someone does in that situation?
Yeah, that sounds like at some point there was a communication breakdown. Hopefully, if those of you who are at earlier stages in this path can help mitigate that by better communication. But if you find yourself in that situation, it can be really difficult to overcome. I think it will require some very sort of careful phrasing of how you're going to start your lab when you go on your interviews. Be very politic about it so that it doesn't come across as like bitter or sort of um, speaking badly about your PI. But you may, without actually saying anything untrue, you may have to find yourself kind of finessing this a little bit. And in the end, you'll be an independent researcher and can do whatever research you want to do. If you get a faculty position, you certainly could continue that line of research anyway. It's, I've, I know there are some fields that are so incredibly competitive that everybody can see what the next experiment is going to be. And it's not just you and your advisor, but also 5 other labs that are also trying to reach the next goal in that field. And that's just a hard place to be. But in most cases, I think even 2 labs that are quote unquote competing are coming at the problem in different ways and end up coexisting in that space pretty well.
So it sounds to me what you're saying is that with this situation, there will be competition, right? That idea of will you be competing with your PI? Yes, you will, because the PI is not willing to compromise with you. And it could be that if you leave with that project, the PI actually can't continue doing it the way you're doing it because you have all the expertise. So over time, the competition may be in your favor and you might just be taking that chance. The question becomes, how do we address this in the interviews? And one of the things you're saying, right? Because we don't want somebody who says, I actually haven't solved this. We don't want to hear that. And so it sounds like you want to make sure you actually don't come across as bitter. You said that, right? Like don't come across as blaming the other person, because you want to probably demonstrate that you will be still able to function with that person in that field, in this collaborative space that is research. But you might still want to hint at the fact that, you have a good chance of getting that funding, and would that be a good way to go about it?
Right. I think, describing it as saying, this is what I brought to the project, and it's this aspect of the project that I'm really going to focus on in my new research. And yes, some of this research will continue in my postdoc lab, but I see them as approaching it in more of this way, whereas I'm going to be taking this angle on it.
I guess it wouldn't hurt to also pitch other projects that you would take right. So you'd be thinking about taking this into the next direction, and clearly that is your direction. And so, maybe that can alleviate this competition.
Yes, I think that's right. I think to the extent you can talk about projects that are distinct from your lab, that is always a good thing. It may not always be an option.
But if you can show that creativity again for a new project, you really demonstrate that you're able to come up with the ideas, on a regular basis. That's great. That's great. Thank you.
I think it's also useful to think about how, why are you getting this interview? Are they interested in having somebody who works on that topic? Or are they interested in somebody with your expertise? Or are they impressed with your productivity? Because it may be all of those reasons, but those play differently into this particular problem. If they are interested in that, if you are in a lab that's developed immunotherapy and they want an immunotherapy lab, and you're going to just be doing the same thing that this other lab is doing, they might worry that in hiring you, you're not going to be able to get enough traction. But if they're interested in your skill set or your productivity, those are things that you bring with you no matter what is happening somewhere else. If you're somebody who's developed really high-end 3D microscopy and you happen to be applying it to a topic that's the same as your postdoc lab's topic, you still are bringing the capabilities of high-end 3D microscopy to your department. And that's going to be a value to them independent of the research.
That's fascinating. That's a really good question to ask, I think, for somebody who's interviewing, to try to figure out why are you finding me interesting as a candidate? And I've never thought of having people ask this, even like at the Skype interview stage, you know, when they say, do you have any questions about us,
Yeah.
for us? Maybe there is a question about, you know.
It's cold to ask in an interview, but you might be able to figure it out. You might be able to know yourself what it is about your research program, and that's attractive to this department.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's excellent feedback. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to let you go. It's
Okay.
11:20. I want to thank you so much for everything you've shared here. This is the first time I actually get to have like all this information given to our trainees. Those of you who have further questions, please let me know. I'll see if I can ask them to Todd later. But thank you, Todd.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah.